This is Demi Burchett's 3.3 Stress, Anxiety and Arousal assignment. This assignment will analyse the different explanations of stress, anxiety and arousal and how they link to having positive or negative implications to a performer's performance in their sport. Through the examples of Nick, Sarah and Rachel, we will demonstrate how these components cause them to react and display certain behaviours which can ultimately affect their performance. Here we have an example of Nick, and he is the number 2 seed in his college, but he has been struggling to play well all season. The new coach has tried to reassure him and say how good he is and how well he should be doing for the college. They've been giving extra coaching time and have been developing his game plan with new and innovative strategies. Nick is feeling nauseous before games and never seems to be able to apply the tactic in them. He struggles to play the more precise and accurate shots, and if he makes an error, his performance falls apart. Incidentally, he is a grade A student, but constantly worries about his grades and spends hours doing homework. We can see from this scenario that Nick is experiencing high levels of stress, which is forcing him to play badly all season, and because he is a grade A student and is constantly worrying about his grades, further highlights this. Stress is a response that is initiated by the body and mind where we perceive that the pressure or demands cannot be coped with, which therefore affects our overall experience in our sports. Cox 1978 defined stress as it can be easily defined as a perceptual phenomenon arising from a comparison between the demand on the person and his or her ability to cope. An imbalance in this mechanism when coping is important, as it gives rise to the experience of stress and to the stress response. One of the most important concepts is the idea about stress, where there is a failure to meet demands, which has important consequences in which the individual perceives their inability to cope or adjust to the demand, according to Lazarus 1991. The body responds to the situation in either a positive or negative way, as McEwen 2002 said. It can be beneficial to the mobilisation of the body's resources, but on the other hand, it can have detrimental effects when the perceived demands exceed the individual's capabilities. And this is shown by the graph on the left-hand side. We can see that the level of stress, once it increases to a certain point, it can then impact our performance. So for a performer who is calm, they have a relatively low level of stress, so that's why they're performing at quite a good level for themselves, maybe their optimum point. So eustress is the positive which impact of stress, which we're going to come to later on, and we can see if we have some positive stress that our performance is actually at its highest, our optimum point. But once we exceed this eustress, we actually enter a phase of de-stress, which is what Nick is showing, which shows his performance is deteriorating because the stress has become too much for him to handle. From this scenario, we notice that Nick is experiencing distress, as we just highlighted, because he always feels nauseous before games and can never apply the tactics. Here he is demonstrating an extreme form of anxiety, which results in him becoming worried and anxious, and therefore perceiving himself to be incapable to play well. It is important to understand that stress can be somatic, cognitive and behavioural, which can affect the body physically, mentally and emotionally. We can see that it's having a negative effect on Nick's performance, and this would activate his autonomic nervous system to form the process of the fight or flight response. This process is the result of hormones being released, which cause our bodies to react to different stimuli in certain ways. But it doesn't just stem from adrenaline, as adrenaline cannot travel to the organs that quickly. It starts at the sensory receptors which detect the stimulus, which is processed then by the brain, and then a message is sent down the central nervous system, which is connected to the muscles and organs that contain ATP. So the nervous system responds immediately to the threat to move out of the way. This causes a fight and flight response, where the sympathetic nervous system responds to this. The hypothalamus sends a signal to the adrenal medulla in the adrenal gland, which releases adrenaline or epinephrine. This is attached to the circulatory system to flow through the body and bind to proteins on the surface of the liver, which will convert glycogen to release it as glucose, so we have a supply of energy. Epinephrine causes the somatic physiological symptoms of stress by travelling in the blood to the lungs to increase breathing rate, to the heart to increase heart rate and the pumping of the cardiac cells, and in the digestive system it will vasoconstrict the blood vessels to slow down digestion, and the blood vessels that fuel these areas in order to redistribute the blood to the active areas of the brain and the muscles so we can respond to the threat by increasing muscle tension. So we could infer from this that Nick is experiencing an increased heart rate and breathing rate, but more importantly muscle tension, which is resulting in him not being able to perform the accurate, precise shots, which then compromise his whole performance. But also mentally, this may cause him to have reduced concentration and make more mistakes, as we can see as highlighted in the scenario, as before he was number 2 at Basvik and probably quite well known in society, but the pressure of a new coach and having this title is potentially a factor that's causing this worry. He may also be starting to show less interest as he is not performing well. He may adopt this mindset where he loses the enjoyment, and this could be also because of the pressures to do well in his exams, so he may be constantly thinking about his grades and homework instead of badminton in order to try to retain his grade A title. We can also consider the behavioural aspects of his behaviour. He's feeling nauseous and unwell, and these nervous habits can affect the mood and bring about symptoms like fidgeting and trembling, which will make his performance fall apart. However, after the game is over, the parasympathetic nervous branch is activated by the peripheral nervous system to allow the body to return to homeostasis, where it's balanced, because the stressor is no longer present and therefore the stress is reduced. In sport, stress can be affected by different stressors, as we can see on the slide. These are the situations that result in a stressful response, and these can range from a variety of factors. So we can see that it can be to do with personal lifestyle, the sporting environment in which the player surrounds themselves in, occupational factors, internal factors, and external factors. So stress can be brought on by personal and lifestyle. For example, if an individual has a significant family member that has high expectations of them to fulfill the image they may have of them, this may result in high stress. Because of the pressures they feel and not wanting to be socially disapproved, this may result in them becoming isolated. Nick's parents may have high expectations of him in order to achieve good grades and maintain being an A-grade student. So Nick may feel lots of pressure to perform well in order to live up to these expectations. Another factor, as we can see on the screen, is occupational stressors. And these are related to a pressure to win or targets and goals from a coach perspective or from the team and Basvik as a college. Nick may feel pressure from the new coach and may be stressed he won't be chosen to play because of his poor performance, even though the new coach has reassured him that he will keep his place on the team. It's still this constant stress in his mind. McGrath 1970 explained how stress is developed and how it starts from the demand that the individual is required to meet in their sport. And this is shown in the diagram in the corner. And it's a series of 4 stages. So for Nick, because he is the number 2 seed at college, he wants to maintain this. Trying to please the new coach and meeting tough opponents results in this demand, which therefore puts immense pressure on him to perform well in order to maintain his title and progress to a higher level due to the expectations. So this becomes the environmental demand, which is stage 1. This then confirms what types of stress it is depending on the perception of the athlete. So as Nick negatively perceives this to see it as a threat, this then results in the changes to the somatic, cognitive and behavioural characteristics where he's experiencing stress. So it's due to the individual's perception. So Nick is perceiving the environmental demand to be negative and he cannot cope with it. There's an inability to cope. And therefore the amount of psychological or physical threat perceived is rapidly increased. This is evident in the nausea and anxiousness he is experiencing before the matches, which then reduces his performance. Because he becomes too critical when receiving his stress, where he then questions his talent, resulting in the rapid deterioration. So the stress response he's initiating, the nausea and the anxiousness, is therefore increasing his arousal to a point where it's beyond his optimum, and he's experiencing these physiological and physical changes, which then results in his poor performance. And then that stage 4, which is the behavioural consequence, which is the outcome where his performance falls apart and therefore to potentially lose the match. We can see from Nick's experience in his matches that he is experiencing high levels of anxiety, both in and out of his sport, as he is constantly worrying about his performance in his subjects and the matches. Buckworth and Dishman 2002 described anxiety as a negative state where we feel worry and apprehension that occurs in the absence of danger and can be accompanied by a heightened state of physiological arousal. This means that the more anxiety we feel, the more aroused we become physiologically, and this can result in a negative emotional state where we feel more fearful and experience more self-doubt because we doubt our capability to handle the demands of the situation. Anxiety is often confused with stress, but anxiety is the reaction we have that is only negative, and that could happen at future date, not just in the moment, whereas stress, as we mentioned, can be positive or negative. As Nick shows that the high anxiety he is experiencing negatively affects his performance time after time in every match. So it is an ongoing process. It doesn't just happen in the moment, it happens in his everyday life, too, with his school work and grades, as he's constantly worrying about exams and trying to succeed. Particularly though, it is important to highlight Nick is experiencing trait anxiety, where he has constant levels of high anxiety all the time. Trait anxiety is based upon the idea that it is a result of a personality trait which is stable, and these enduring characteristics that are considered unchangeable. They make up the core of our personality. So these people are more anxious and become more panicked at most things in their lives because they have an inbuilt proneness to worry. This makes these people more likely to overreact, and due to becoming aroused more quickly and becoming threatened, makes them more likely to have high levels of anxiety in all situations of their life. It is important to note that individuals with high trait anxiety will respond with high levels of anxiety even if the situation is not really that threatening or dangerous, because they are considered to be born with high levels of anxiety which are unchangeable. If you have high levels of state anxiety, you probably will be more at risk of having high state anxiety and therefore distress. People with high trait anxiety are more likely to focus on failure, so Nick would be worrying about upsetting his parents and his college and coach if he performs badly, which could result in him not being able to play anymore, but also focusing on past experiences that have been negative, and the consequences may cause Nick to focus on them. And because in his previous games as well that he's having trouble performing well, he just sort of refers back to this idea where he keeps thinking in his head, it's just going to be like the last game, it's just going to be like the last game. So he's sort of adopted this like negative mindset now where he just sort of falls back on himself and he has no self-confidence. There's been evidence that has shown that athletes that display low trait anxiety focus on the success rather than the failure, and they respond more positively to their mistakes by directing their attention to the current situation to motivate them to work harder and overcome both physically and emotionally after mistakes to make a comeback and then continue to strive to win. And this is what I basically just said. This graph is showing that someone who has low trait anxiety has more control over the pressure of the demand. So this is why they can retain their anxiety from around 3 to 4, whereas someone who has high trait anxiety would have less control and wouldn't be able to cope with the pressures. And we can see it from the graph that it increases from 5 to 9 fairly quickly. So, and this would then, because they're not able to have the control over their performance, then that will cause it to deteriorate quite quickly. So whereas someone with low trait anxiety after a mistake, they would be able to sort of bounce back and not let it affect their performance than someone with high strength anxiety who would just sort of give up.